Lord Thomas Howard was the first physical casualty of a death warrant drafted exclusively to serve King Henry VIII's personal vendetta. Upon discovering the nobleman's secret engagement to his niece, the king forced Parliament to draft emergency legislation, legally transforming a verbal civil agreement into a capital treason offense. Rather than utilizing a public scaffold, this newly fabricated legal machinery deposited Howard directly into the stone cells of the Tower of London, severing his access to basic survival resources. He physically rotted away in the freezing darkness, becoming the victim of a legal document born entirely out of territorial jealousy. How terrifying is a judicial system that can be rewritten overnight strictly to legally justify the slow starvation of a single individual. The target of this unprecedented legal wrath, Lord Thomas Howard, was born around 1511. He was the youngest son of Thomas Howard, the second Duke of Norfolk, and his second wife, Agnes Tilney. He was born into a political environment that demanded absolute ambition. The Howard family was not just an aristocratic household. They functioned as a massive, highly organized political syndicate. They were the premier noble dynasty in the country. They wielded immense influence over government policy, national defense, and foreign diplomacy. They were the established leaders of the conservative faction at court, frequently clashing with reformist ministers like Thomas Cromwell. Their proximity to the throne was unmatched. The Howards would eventually engineer the rise of two of their own women, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. Both women were Thomas's nieces, and both were placed directly onto the throne as queens of England. Thomas was raised in a family where managing the royal succession was considered a standard family business. They viewed power not as a privilege, but as an inherent right. Despite carrying this elite bloodline, Thomas Howard possessed zero financial security. He faced a brutal economic reality dictated entirely by the strict legal framework of 16th century England. The English aristocracy operated on the absolute uncompromising principle of primogeniture. Primogeniture was the legal foundation of the Tudor social order. It mandated that upon a father's death, the eldest son inherited the entirety of the estate. This system was enforced by the state to keep massive aristocratic landholdings intact. It ensured that leading families could provide concentrated military levies and unified tax revenue to the crown. It prevented wealth from being diluted across multiple generations. For the Howard family, this meant the vast country estates, the immense generational wealth, the private armies, and the prestigious dukedom completely bypassed Thomas. All of these assets went directly to his much older half-brother, Thomas Howard, the third Duke of Norfolk. Thomas possessed the title of Lord, but in practical terms, this was merely a decorative designation. It allowed him to walk the halls of the royal palaces and stand in the king's presence. However, it put no money in his accounts. He was entirely landless. He was financially dependent on the unreliable goodwill of his older brother or the charity of the crown. For a younger son in Tudor England, the path to survival was incredibly narrow. You were born into the highest echelon of society. You were surrounded by staggering wealth, eating off silver plates and engaging in high-stakes diplomacy. Yet, you personally owned nothing. If you angered your family, you could be financially cut off instantly. Thomas had no agricultural land to generate rental income. He had no military force to command respect from his peers. He had to maintain the incredibly expensive outward appearance of a nobleman while managing a hollow bank account. Courtiers were expected to wear expensive velvet and silk, employ personal servants, and participate in high-stakes gambling. Maintaining this facade was necessary to retain social standing. His options were bleak. He could seek a military command, which required expensive outfitting and carried a high risk of death. He could attempt to secure a royal pension through years of subservient administrative service, or he could pursue the most effective weapon available to a landless noble, a strategic marriage. He needed a bride who possessed massive independent wealth to fund his lifestyle, or exceptional royal bloodlines that could force the king to grant him lands. Marriage in this environment was an economic merger and a political treaty. It was a calculated necessity for social survival. Thomas was a highly educated political operator waiting for a specific opportunity to secure his permanent future. In 1536, the chaotic machinery of the Tudor dynasty fractured, handing him that exact opportunity. The year 1536 brought a massive political earthquake that shook the foundations of the English government. It created an unprecedented vacuum of power. The crisis began in January when Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, died in isolation. Because of the religious break with the Catholic Church in Rome in the subsequent legal maneuvers by the crown, her daughter Mary was officially pushed out of the line of succession. She was declared illegitimate. Then the brutal events of May unfolded with terrifying speed. Queen Anne Boleyn rapidly lost the king's favor. She was arrested on charges of treason and adultery, tried by a jury of her peers, and beheaded on Tower Green. The powerful Howard family, heavily tied to Anne's rise, was plunged into a severe crisis of survival. King Henry VIII immediately married his third wife, Jane Seymour. However, the new queen was not yet pregnant. The English government required a clear, undisputed line of inheritance to prevent civil war upon the monarch's death. To address this, the English Parliament passed the Second Succession Act during that highly volatile summer. This sweeping legislation formally declared both Mary and Elizabeth to be illegitimate. It completely stripped them of any legal right to inherit the crown. For the first time in his reign, King Henry VIII had no legitimate direct heir to the throne. The succession was entirely shattered. This massive constitutional void rapidly elevated a young woman residing at court. Her name was Lady Margaret Douglas. Born in 1515, Margaret was the daughter of Margaret Tudor, the Queen Dowager of Scotland. Margaret Tudor was the older sister of King Henry VIII. With the king's own daughters legally removed from the picture by Parliament, Margaret Douglas suddenly became the person with the highest legitimate royal blood currently residing in England. She effectively became the heiress presumptive to the English throne. For King Henry VIII, Margaret was a priceless national security asset. She was a crucial diplomatic tool. The king intended to use her as a royal pawn, marrying her off to a foreign monarch to forge heavy military alliances with European superpowers like France or the Holy Roman Empire. But Lord Thomas Howard saw an entirely different opportunity staring him in the face. He recognized that whoever controlled Margaret Douglas would control the future of the English government. He abandoned his search for a wealthy heiress and focused entirely on the king's niece. He prepared to make a move that would fundamentally alter the history of the British monarchy, to execute a political maneuver that threatened the English succession. Lord Thomas Howard and Lady Margaret Douglas required a sophisticated method of camouflage. The royal palaces of Whitehall and Greenwich were not private residences. They were sprawling, highly regulated arenas of constant surveillance. Hundreds of courtiers, foreign ambassadors, royal guards, and servants occupied the same physical spaces. Every conversation was monitored, and every alliance was heavily scrutinized. The king's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, operated a highly efficient domestic intelligence network. This system relied heavily on paid informants, intercepted correspondence, and the interrogation of household staff. To bypass this surveillance, Thomas and Margaret utilized the deeply entrenched cultural norms of the Tudor aristocracy. They hid their political conspiracy behind the socially acceptable facade of courtly love. Courtly love was a highly stylized artificial social game played by the English nobility. It involved young men declaring exaggerated devotion to high-ranking women. Participants exchanged written verses, engaged in flirtatious banter during elaborate court masques, and wore visual tokens of affection. Because this behavior was completely normalized within the royal household, it provided the perfect cover for illicit communication. The king and his ministers were accustomed to seeing young courtiers engaging in standard flirtation. When they observed Thomas Howard interacting with Margaret Douglas, they saw a conventional social performance. They entirely failed to recognize that this specific interaction was building the foundation for a constitutional coup. The primary vehicle for their secret communication was a physical object that has survived into the modern era. Historians and literary scholars now refer to it as the Devonshire manuscript. The Devonshire manuscript was not a formally published book. It was a communal handwritten notebook, originally belonging to the intimate circle of women serving Queen Anne Boleyn. The book was passed quietly among a trusted network of courtiers. It contained transcriptions of popular contemporary poetry, including works by Sir Thomas Wyatt, mixed with original verses written by the courtiers themselves. Thomas and Margaret weaponized this specific notebook. They utilized the blank spaces and margins of the manuscript to conduct a covert, highly dangerous dialogue. They composed original coded poems that addressed their specific political peril. Their verses did not focus merely on romance. They wrote about enduring extreme hardship, maintaining absolute loyalty in the face of tyrannical wrath, and defying the overwhelming power of their political enemies. Through this shared manuscript, they solidified their political alignment and negotiated the terms of their future without drawing the immediate suspicion of Cromwell's spies. Having established absolute trust through this covert communication, Thomas and Margaret took the final, irreversible step. In the shadows of the Tudor court, they entered into a specific legal arrangement that fundamentally threatened the security of the English crown. They did not require a priest, a cathedral, or a grand public ceremony to forge a legally binding union. They utilized a highly potent mechanism within 16th century ecclesiastical law known as sponsalia per verba de presenti. This Latin legal term translates directly to espousal by words in the present tense. While King Henry VIII had recently broken England's political ties with the Pope in Rome, The newly established Church of England still relied almost entirely on ancient Catholic canon law to govern matters of marriage, morality, and inheritance. Under this strict legal code, the state and the church recognized that the ultimate sacrament of marriage was conferred not by the clergy, but by the couple themselves. If a man and a woman freely uttered a mutual vow of commitment using the present tense, explicitly declaring, "I take you as my wife and I take you as my husband," before at least one credible witness, they created an immediate permanent legal bond. By speaking these specific words, Lord Thomas Howard and Lady Margaret Douglas were not merely engaged or betrothed in a modern, easily breakable sense. Legally and theologically, they were married. This spoken vow was absolutely binding. It carried the exact same legal weight as a formal church wedding. The extreme danger of a de presenti contract lay in its sheer indissolubility. A standard political engagement could be broken by a monarch or a parent. However, a valid de presenti vow could not be easily erased. It could not be annulled by a secular magistrate or a king. To break such a contract required a massive, highly public ecclesiastical tribunal. Even then, annulments were only granted if specific pre-existing legal impediments could be proven, such as a prior existing marriage or a close degree of consanguinity, blood relation. Thomas and Margaret had no such legal impediments. Their contract was ironclad. The geopolitical implications of this whispered vow were apocalyptic for King Henry VIII. This severity was due entirely to the English common law doctrine of coverture. The doctrine of coverture dictated the legal status of women upon marriage. When a woman married, she became a femme covert. Her independent legal identity was completely eclipsed by that of her husband. Her political standing, her physical property, her financial assets, and her executive agency were entirely subsumed and controlled by him. By securing Margaret Douglas as his legally binding wife, Lord Thomas Howard had executed a flawless, bloodless takeover of the English succession. If King Henry VIII were to die, Margaret Douglas possessed the strongest legitimate claim to step onto the English throne as queen. However, because of the inescapable laws of coverture, Margaret would not rule independently. Lord Thomas Howard would automatically be elevated to the position of king consort. He would possess the legal authority to direct her reign. This meant that the Howard family would gain total unhindered control over the nation. The faction led by Thomas's ruthless older brother, the Duke of Norfolk, would control the royal treasury. They would dictate foreign policy. They would command the national military. Lord Thomas Howard, a landless younger son who owned nothing, had utilized a loophole in canon law to position himself to inherit the entire country. A secret of this magnitude could not remain hidden indefinitely within the Tudor state. By July 1536, the intelligence network managed by Thomas Cromwell detected the anomaly. Whispers of the secret binding contract reached Cromwell's agents. He immediately launched a clandestine investigation. Servants were interrogated. The movement of the Devonshire manuscript was tracked, and the reality of the de presenti vow was laid bare. Cromwell carried this devastating intelligence directly to King Henry VIII. The king's reaction was not mere political frustration. It was an intense, paranoid fury. This explosive anger was a direct product of his fragile political reality in the summer of 1536. Henry VIII felt intensely vulnerable. He was completely surrounded by perceived betrayal. Just weeks prior, he had suffered the profound political humiliation of executing his own queen, Anne Boleyn, on charges of adultery and treason. Anne Boleyn was a Howard. Now the king discovered that another member of the Howard family, Anne's own uncle, Lord Thomas, was actively manipulating the succession behind his back. Furthermore, the king had just forced Parliament to bastardize his own daughters to secure the realm. He had no male heir. His dynasty was highly unstable. To discover that a landless aristocrat had successfully stolen his most valuable diplomatic asset and hijacked the line of succession was the ultimate treason. The king viewed Lord Thomas Howard as a highly calculating predator who had actively plotted to usurp the English throne. King Henry VIII demanded absolute, immediate, and lethal retaliation. He ordered Thomas Cromwell and the Crown's top legal counsel to draft formal charges of high treason against Lord Thomas Howard. He wanted the man dragged to Tower Hill and executed. However, when the king's lawyers examined the case, the Tudor state slammed into a massive, immovable legal wall. The king demanded blood, but the established laws of England simply did not support an execution. The active, binding law of the land regarding capital offenses against the state was the Treason Act of 1351. This statute was passed 2 centuries earlier by King Edward III. It was specifically designed to restrict the arbitrary power of the monarch. It was written to prevent kings from executing their political rivals on a whim. Therefore, the Treason Act of 1351 possessed a very specific, incredibly narrow definition of what constituted high treason. Under this ancient law, a man faced conviction for high treason only if the government proved specific actions. First, it was treason to actively plan the murder of the king, the queen, or their eldest son. Second, leading or funding an armed rebellion against the king within his own country also qualified as a treasonous act. The law required clear evidence of these physical deeds. The statute also defined treason as providing direct help or comfort to the king's enemies during a time of war. Additionally, the law strictly protected the royal bloodline by making unauthorized sexual relations a capital offense. A man committed treason if he violated the queen, the king's eldest unmarried daughter, or his eldest son's wife. These strict criteria set a very clear legal boundary. Thomas Cromwell and the highest legal minds in England stared at the statute in absolute paralysis. Making a legally binding marriage contract with the king's niece did not violate a single clause of this law. Lord Thomas Howard had not raised a private army. He had not plotted to physically assassinate the monarch. He had not offered aid to foreign enemies. He had not violated the queen. He had simply utilized the existing recognized laws of the Catholic Church to marry a high-ranking noble woman. Thomas Howard's actions were politically devastating. They were utterly defiant. They were deeply insulting to the king's authority. But they were technically entirely legal. If the state formally arrested Lord Thomas Howard and dragged him before a standard common law court, the trial would be a disaster for the crown. The judges were bound by their oaths to uphold the law. Relying on the strict text of the 1351 statute, they would have no choice. They would be legally forced to acquit him. Such an outcome was completely unacceptable to King Henry VIII. An acquittal would be a massive, humiliating public defeat. It would signal to the entire English nobility that the king could be legally outsmarted. It would prove that the crown was subservient to the law, dealing a severe blow to Henry's absolute centralized authority. King Henry VIII flatly refused to accept this legal reality. A crisis point was reached. If the ancient established laws of England protected the man who had stolen his heir, then the king would have to make a terrifying decision regarding the constitution of his own country. King Henry VIII was a monarch who fundamentally believed that the law existed to serve the crown, not to restrict it. He had already demonstrated a profound willingness to dismantle ancient institutions when they obstructed his will. He had severed England's centuries-old political ties with the Roman Catholic Church. He had executed his own anointed queen. He had forced the state to bastardize his own children to secure his dynasty. He was certainly not about to let a landless younger son outmaneuver him simply because a statute from the 14th century failed to anticipate this specific dynastic threat. When the king's legal counsel confirmed the devastating reality that Lord Thomas Howard could not be convicted under the Treason Act of 1351, Henry VIII made a terrifying, autocratic decision. If the existing laws of England protected the man who had actively compromised the royal lineage, then the king would simply rewrite the constitutional foundation of the country to destroy him. He would invent a new crime, and he would apply it retroactively. To eliminate the threat permanently, King Henry VIII bypassed the standard common law justice system entirely. He turned his attention to the English Parliament. In the Tudor era, Parliament was not an independent democratic legislative body designed to check executive power. It was largely an instrument of royal will. The House of Lords and the House of Commons were packed with nobles, bishops, and gentlemen who were acutely aware of the king's volatile temper. They understood that defying the king on a matter of state security could result in their own financial ruin or physical destruction. Henry VIII utilized this legislative body as a specialized, highly efficient machine for bureaucratic execution. On July 18, 1536, the king's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, introduced a specific legislative weapon into Parliament. It was aimed squarely and exclusively at Lord Thomas Howard. This weapon was a bill of attainder. An act of attainder was the most extreme lethal manifestation of state power in English legal history. While it had been utilized in previous centuries, primarily during the chaotic Wars of the Roses, to strip defeated battlefield enemies of their lands and titles, the attainder of Lord Thomas Howard represented a chilling evolution of domestic legal tyranny. This legislative act condemned Thomas to a brutal traitor's death without a trial. The fundamental rights established by Magna Carta were entirely suspended. There was no judge appointed to hear the case. There was no jury of his peers assembled to weigh the facts. There was no presentation of independent evidence or cross-examination of witnesses. Furthermore, Thomas was entirely stripped of his right to offer a legal defense. He was not permitted to stand before his accusers in Parliament. He was not allowed to call witnesses to verify the nature of the De Praesenti vow. He was denied the opportunity to argue the complex nuances of canon law that validated his actions. He was simply voted to death in absentia by politicians who were terrified of inciting the king's wrath. More terrifyingly, from a legal standpoint, this was a blatant ex post facto law. The act of attainder took an action that was technically legal at the exact moment it was committed, entering into a Catholic de presenti marriage contract, and retroactively classified it as high treason. The punishment mandated for this newly invented crime was the standard penalty for treason against the state, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. The king, however, was not content with merely executing Lord Thomas Howard. Henry VIII possessed a highly strategic mind. He wanted to ensure that no ambitious courtier or rival aristocratic faction could ever exploit this specific legal loophole again. Therefore, the same act of attainder that condemned Thomas to death also permanently changed the security protocols surrounding the entire royal family. The act established a new sweeping constitutional law. It stated that anyone who attempted to form a marriage contract with a member of the royal bloodline without the monarch's explicit prior written permission would instantly be guilty of high treason. This law specifically applied to the king's children, sisters, aunts, and nieces. With the stroke of a legislative pen, the physical bodies, romantic attachments, and reproductive capabilities of the extended royal family were officially nationalized. They were formally stripped of their personal agency. They were legally classified as highly sensitive, heavily guarded national security assets. Lord Thomas Howard's whispered vow in a palace corridor had forced a massive constitutional shift. It effectively ripped the ultimate authority over royal marriages away from the church and placed it firmly, permanently in the hands of the secular government. This specific legislative maneuver laid the direct groundwork for the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, a law that continues to govern the British monarchy centuries later. By late July 1536, the Act of Attainder had passed both houses of Parliament and received royal assent. Lord Thomas Howard was legally a dead man walking. King Henry VIII possessed the full, unassailable legal authority to drag Thomas out to Tower Hill and execute him immediately. Yet the king chose a different, far more agonizing path. He ordered Thomas locked deep within the bell tower of the Tower of London. The king deliberately withheld his signature from the final death warrant. This delay was not an act of mercy. It was a highly calculated strategy of political extortion. During the exact period Thomas was condemned, the political landscape of England exploded into unprecedented chaos. A massive, highly organized, and terrifying rebellion, known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, erupted in the northern counties of England. The northern population was enraged by the violent destruction of the monasteries, rising agricultural taxes, and the king's radical religious reforms. Tens of thousands of heavily armed men led by capable gentlemen and minor nobles marched against the crown. It was the greatest military and existential threat Henry VIII would face during his entire 38-year reign. The royal standing army was vastly outnumbered by the rebel forces. The king desperately needed a brilliant, seasoned military commander to march north and physically crush the rebellion. The man he chose for this vital, high-stakes task was Thomas's older half-brother, the ruthless Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk. By keeping Lord Thomas alive in a damp cell, the king held the ultimate visceral leverage over the powerful duke. It was an unspoken, brutal understanding between the sovereign and his top general. If Norfolk crushed the rebellion and proved his absolute military loyalty to the crown Perhaps his younger brother would be permitted to keep his head. If Norfolk failed, or if he showed any sympathy to the Catholic rebels, his brother would die that very day. Lord Thomas Howard was no longer a dangerous claimant to the throne. He had been reduced to a high-value political hostage. The state kept him breathing solely to guarantee his older brother's obedience on the battlefield. However, being a political hostage in Tudor England was a grueling physical and financial endurance test. The Act of Attainder triggered a devastating legal mechanism known as the corruption of blood. Upon the passage of the act, Thomas was instantly legally stripped of his titles, his social status, and any financial resources he possessed. His assets were absorbed by the crown. He legally ceased to exist as a nobleman. This legal status was catastrophic because the Tudor prison system was deeply corrupt and highly transactional. The state did not utilize taxpayer funds to keep prisoners comfortable. Inmates, even high-ranking nobles from ancient families, were expected to pay completely out of their own pockets for their survival. Prisoners had to purchase their food, their lodging, their firewood, and the basic comforts required to survive incarceration directly from the lieutenant of the tower. If a prisoner had substantial wealth, the Tower of London could serve as a relatively comfortable, albeit restrictive, house arrest. They could order wine, fresh meat, and clean linens. If a prisoner had no money, the Tower was a slow, agonizing death sentence. Without any personal funds and legally stripped of his rank, Thomas was plunged into absolute, immediate destitution. His own family, the mighty Howard Syndicate, completely cut off all financial support and communication. Terrified by the king's sweeping wrath and desperate to distance themselves from his treason to save their own lucrative positions at court, the Howards abandoned their youngest son. They left him to rot. Thomas was placed in a harsh, isolated cell as the freezing, unforgiving winter of 1536 set in. The thick stone walls offered zero insulation against the plummeting temperatures. The heavy, toxic dampness from the nearby River Thames seeped directly into the masonry and into his bones. Because he could not afford to pay the guards for decent provisions, he was forced to survive on the poorest, most contaminated rations the tower had to offer. He was denied clean water and adequate clothing. This hostile environment rapidly destroyed his immune system. King Henry VIII had discovered a highly effective way to eliminate a political threat without officially signing a death warrant. He avoided making a messy public spectacle on the executioner's block. It was a calculated strategy of passive execution by deliberate neglect. State records and frantic letters from the period detail the horrific physical toll on his body. Thomas soon contracted a severe ague. In 16th century medical terminology, this word was used to describe cyclical, debilitating, and often lethal fevers. He had likely contracted a severe strain of malaria from the marshy, mosquito-infested areas surrounding the river. Alternatively, he may have suffered from typhoid fever, born from the contaminated water and appalling sanitation of his cell. To compound his physical suffering, the contaminated food caused violent dysentery. This condition rapidly deteriorated his digestive tract. It caused severe dehydration, excruciating abdominal pain, and internal bleeding. The man who had successfully outmaneuvered the king's legal counsel was now shivering in the dark, watching his own body consume itself. While the powerful men of the Howard family abandoned him to save their own political careers, one person fought frantically for his survival. His mother, the Dowager Duchess Agnes Tilney, was terrified by the reports of her son's rapidly failing health. She utilized her remaining influence to send desperate, begging petitions directly to the king's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell. She wisely bypassed the political implications of his treason. She did not argue for his innocence. She pleaded on a purely humanitarian level. She asked Cromwell to send the king's personal physicians to examine her dying son. She pleaded for Thomas to simply be moved to a drier, warmer room within the massive Tower complex, so he might recover his strength to face his punishment later. She offered to pay whatever heavy financial fines the king required out of her own jointure. The crown responded with calculated, lethal administrative silence. The regime deliberately ignored every single request for medical intervention or basic comfort. Thomas Cromwell filed the letters away, and the king refused to intervene. Thomas was left entirely alone in the freezing dark. The physical diseases were rapidly destroying his internal organs, but a devastating, deeply personal political betrayal was about to break his remaining spirit. As the freezing winter of 1536 bled into the harsh spring of 1537, Lord Thomas Howard's physical body was systematically failing him in the damp isolation of the Tower of London. Denied medical care, starved of basic nutrition, and abandoned by his powerful family, he was a man being actively erased by the Tudor state. However, the final fatal blow to Thomas Howard would not be delivered by the king's guards or a Tudor physician. It would be delivered by the very woman he had risked his life to marry. Inside another set of heavily guarded apartments within the Tower of London, Lady Margaret Douglas was also being held as a high-value prisoner of the state. As the king's niece and the woman who had nearly hijacked the English succession, she fully realized the sheer, unbridled ruthlessness of her uncle's rage. She had seen her cousin, Queen Anne Boleyn, beheaded just months prior. Margaret recognized that her own life was hanging by a very thin, rapidly fraying thread. But Margaret possessed the political survival instincts inherent to the Tudor bloodline. As she evaluated her terrifying predicament, she realized she had one crucial detail working in her favor. It was a theological and legal loophole she could ruthlessly exploit to save her own neck. While she and Thomas had exchanged the binding, the presenti vows that constituted a legal marriage under Catholic canon law, their secret engagement had been abruptly discovered before it could progress to physical consummation. In 16th century ecclesiastical law, a marriage contract was considered legally binding the moment the vows were spoken. However, it was considered absolutely indissoluble only after it had been physically consummated. Because they had never shared a marital bed, the contract, while legally potent, was technically vulnerable to a royal pardon. Securing that pardon, however, required Margaret to completely surrender her personal agency to the king and utterly destroy her partner in the process. Margaret saw a narrow, desperate path out of the Tower. She made a highly calculated, cold-blooded decision to submit entirely to the immense power of the state. She began writing formal, highly submissive letters directly to King Henry VIII and his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell. The tone of these letters was a masterclass in Tudor self-preservation. She did not defend Thomas Howard. She did not defend their love or the shared poetry of the Devonshire manuscript. Instead, she threw him directly to the wolves. Margaret blamed the entire secret marriage on the foolishness, naivety, and impulsivity of youth. She explicitly declared that she recognized her grave error, stating that she was completely abandoning the legal contract. She begged for the king's forgiveness and placed her entire fate, her reproductive future, and her absolute loyalty solely in the hands of the monarch. This single calculated act of self-preservation completely severed the bond between them. It legally and emotionally dissolved the threat they posed as a couple. More importantly, it stripped Lord Thomas Howard of his only remaining political value. Thomas was no longer the king consort in waiting. He was no longer a dangerous claimant to the throne who held the keys to the kingdom. Because Margaret had publicly and legally disavowed him, he was now just a sick, destitute man locked in a box. He was completely abandoned by his partner, his powerful family, and the legal system of his country. As the agonizing months dragged on into the late autumn of 1537, Thomas Howard's health reached a critical terminal stage. But outside the thick stone walls of his prison, the political landscape of England, the very landscape that had made him so dangerous, was about to undergo a seismic shift. On October 12, 1537, at Hampton Court Palace, Queen Jane Seymour finally gave birth. It was a difficult, grueling labor, but the outcome was exactly what King Henry VIII had spent decades and sacrificed 2 wives to achieve. The child was a healthy, living male heir, Prince Edward, the future King Edward VI. The birth of a legitimate male prince triggered wild, hysterical celebrations across England. Bonfires were lit, wine flowed in the streets, and a collective sigh of relief echoed through the government. England officially had an undisputed male successor. For the prisoners in the Tower, this news had immediate, profound consequences. The political value of Lady Margaret Douglas instantly plummeted overnight. With a male heir securely placed in the royal nursery, Margaret was no longer the heiress presumptive. She was no longer the sole key to the Tudor dynasty. Consequently, the massive existential threat posed by her secret contract with Thomas Howard evaporated completely. Even if Thomas had been healthy, and even if Margaret had not disavowed him, their marriage no longer threatened the direct line of succession. Thomas Howard was officially entirely irrelevant to national security. The birth of Prince Edward rendered Thomas Howard's continued imprisonment a mere formality of a tyrant's vengeance. The king had secured his dynasty, but he felt absolutely no inclination to show mercy to the man who had dared to challenge him. Just over 2 weeks after the birth of the new prince, the prolonged passive execution of Lord Thomas Howard finally reached its conclusion. On October 31st, 1537, Thomas took his last breath in his freezing, isolated cell. His organs had simply failed after 16 months of relentless disease, starvation, dampness, and profound psychological despair. He was only 26 years old. Because Thomas was legally classified as an attainted traitor, his body was initially treated with zero respect by the state. There was no grand funeral cortege, no Howard family mourning period, and no aristocratic ceremony. However, his mother, Agnes Tilney, secured a final somber victory by petitioning Thomas Cromwell for her son's remains. King Henry VIII eventually granted her request, under the strict condition that the burial remain devoid of any pomp. Consequently, Thomas's body was released to the Howard family and transported to Thetford Abbey in Norfolk. There, he was interred quietly within the family's ancestral lands, far from the capital's prying eyes and the king's vengeful reach. The cynical, highly transactional nature of Tudor justice was vividly demonstrated in the days immediately following Thomas's death. Mere days after Thomas Howard's body was lowered into the earth, Lady Margaret Douglas was granted a full royal pardon because the man she had contracted herself to was dead, and because the birth of Prince Edward meant she was no longer a dynastic threat. The king deemed her safe. She was released from the Tower and rapidly restored to her highly privileged position at the royal court. Margaret walked away from the wreckage of their shared ambition. She would go on to live a long, highly influential life, eventually marrying Matthew Stewart, the Earl of Lennox. She secured her own powerful legacy, becoming the mother of Lord Darnley and the grandmother of King James VI of Scotland, who would eventually unite the crowns of England and Scotland. Thomas Howard, conversely, was deliberately erased from the public record. Historical arguments still occasionally surface regarding the true nature of their relationship. Was it genuine, passionate affection, or cold, calculated political ambition? The coded poems that survived in the margins of the Devonshire manuscript suggest a deep emotional attachment between the two young courtiers. They wrote eloquently to one another of enduring love, shared suffering, and defiance against the king's tyranny. However, the harsh political reality of their actions is undeniable. Thomas Howard was a highly educated, deeply ambitious man who was intimately aware of the laws of succession. He knew exactly what placing a ring on Margaret's finger meant for his family's future, his own wealth, and the stability of the realm. In the 16th century, it was entirely possible for genuine human affection and fierce predatory political ambition to exist simultaneously in the exact same action. The profound tragedy of their story lies in the unequal cost of survival. While Margaret possessed the royal blood and the strategic ruthlessness required to sacrifice that affection to survive the wrath of the king, Thomas, as the landless younger son, could not escape the brutal political consequences of his gamble. Lord Thomas Howard never commanded an army in the field. He never won a famous military battle. He never held a high government office. But his quiet, reckless maneuvering in the shadows of the court forced a massive constitutional shift in English history that resonates to this day. His legal trial by Parliament, the terrifying Act of Attainder of 1536, effectively nationalized the royal bloodline. By rewriting the Treason Act to specifically target unauthorized royal marriages, the state forcibly ripped the ultimate authority over royal matrimony away from the Catholic Church and placed it firmly, permanently in the hands of the secular government. This established an unshakable precedent. The romantic attachments and reproductive choices of the royal family were officially classified as matters of state security. The aggressive legislative tactics used to destroy Thomas Howard laid the direct groundwork for the future management of the British monarchy. Centuries later, this exact same logic, born from the panic Thomas Howard caused, was utilized by King George III. Frustrated by the secret marriages of his own siblings, George III pushed Parliament to pass the Royal Marriages Act of 1772. This landmark act formally dictated that no descendant of the royal family could marry without the explicit, formal, written consent of the reigning monarch. It was a legal mechanism specifically designed to protect the integrity of the crown from ambitious courtiers seeking to marry their way into absolute power. Every time a modern British royal seeks the monarch's permission to wed, they are engaging in a legal protocol that was directly birthed by the terrified reaction of King Henry VIII to Lord Thomas Howard. The tragic, obscure end of Lord Thomas Howard reveals a dark, unvarnished reality about proximity to absolute power. He was an intensely ambitious man who understood the rigid rules of his society perfectly. He identified a legitimate legal loophole to secure his future and nearly capture a throne without spilling a single drop of blood. But he severely underestimated the paranoia of a monarch who felt his absolute control slipping. King Henry VIII proved that in an autocracy, the law is not a shield for the clever. When the written law fails to protect the crown will simply tear up the Constitution and rewrite the law specifically to crush the individual. Thomas Howard was not defeated by a stronger army or a sharper legal mind. He was suffocated by a state that willingly weaponized isolation, physical illness, and the legislative process itself. His lonely death in that freezing cell serves as a haunting historical lesson. When absolute power feels genuinely threatened, there is no amount of legal cleverness and no aristocratic bloodline that can save you from its crushing weight.